The wind comes first, dry, restless, rattling the mesquite as if searching for a secret. A lone lamp throws a weak circle on a plank boardwalk, and a saloon piano clinks to a stop. Somewhere out there, a rider slips into the darkness beyond town, and a whisper chases him. John Wesley Hardin. Not just a name, but a warning. The kind of name the prairie carries for miles. They will tell you he was quicker than a rattler and twice as mean. They will say his 6 guns spoke a language the frontier understood better than statutes. The truth, like sand, doesn't stay put. It drifts between what men saw, what they swore, and what they wanted to believe. Yet the bones of the story are firm enough. He was born on May 26, 1853 in Bonham, Fannin County, Texas, son of James Gibson Hardin, a circuit-riding Methodist preacher, schoolteacher, and sometimes lawyer. He was named for John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, as if the old world might pin a saint's mantle on a child of the new. Even in his boyhood shadow, trouble took an early liking to him. In 1867, a schoolyard flare-up ended with young Wes stabbing another boy, a sign, some said, that temper and steel already slept in the same pocket. Texas itself had changed its clothes by then. The war was over, the Union's boots still muddying the floors of courthouses, and Reconstruction's hard rules gnawed at white Texas pride. Law had come, yes, but it came wearing another man's hat. Many refused to tip their brim. The line between a dare and a death was narrow in those years. At 15 in Polk County, Hardin shot and killed a black man after an argument, his first killing by the common account, though it's wrapped in fog and faction. Hardin's later telling names the man as Major, a freedman tied by memory to a wrestling match gone sour. Whether that's gospel or self-justification is for God and historians to argue. What's clearer is the current that pulled him under. Union soldiers and state police tasked with keeping order in a land that wanted none of theirs. Hardin claimed that, later in 1868, 3 soldiers came to take him in and never rode back. Men repeated the story under their breath, then louder, until it sounded like fate. To understand the boy, you have to step into the time. Reconstruction, Texas was a suture poorly sewn, freed people testing rights they'd been promised, ex-Confederates nursing 1,000 grudges, and counties where the sheriff's badge could mean either safety or score settling. In the piney reaches and river bottoms, a teenager with a fast hand could grow into the kind of sin that wears a crown. Hardin's father, a man of sermons and grammar slates, tried to steer him toward gentler pages, but the frontier wrote in gunpowder and hoofbeats. The prairie breeds a certain silence around violence. You hear the story after. The thud of a body, the long pause, the horse that won't settle. By the late 1860s, whispers in churchyards and feed stores attached numbers to the boy, as if souls were poker chips. 1, then more. Some soldiers in a creek bed. An argument spun into death. The accounts lean different ways, but they tilt toward blood. Even those who pitied him would admit the pattern. Hardin's fuse was short, and the steel was close at hand. Where law ran thin, kin and friends made up the difference. Hardin slipped to a brother's place north of Sumter when the air turned hot with warrants. Nights he would listen for the creak of a gate, the cough of a stranger's horse. Some say he slept in his boots. Some say he never slept at all. The older men watched him and read the omen. A boy who had killed once would be hunted by men who had killed before. In Texas those years, a posse could be official or invented on the spot, and justice could ride a mean mule. It is here that the seed of myth germinates. A 15-year-old becomes a moving target, and the story begins to run faster than the writer. Newspapers would later fatten the legend. Hardin himself, in pages penned behind bars, would shuck off guilt and claim self-defense like a second skin. Somewhere between the handbills and his autobiography lies a young man who found, early and often, that drawing first shortened arguments. Britannica's neat summation, at least 21 men, feels like a clean shirt laid over a body that never stayed clean. Hardin boasted of more. Ranch hands counted less. The dead had no vote. Picture him in those first fugitive months. The hat tugged low, a colt that felt familiar, even cold. The road to kinfolks' cabins etched into muscle. Hands that could settle a horse or a quarrel in the same heartbeat. He didn't yet wear the mask of the seasoned outlaw, the professional chill that comes later. He was still raw, still surprised at how quickly a man disappears after the air leaves him. But something else had begun to live in him, a certainty that the state, its uniforms, its courts, its sworn men, had become an opposing tribe. If they came again, he'd read their faces first and their warrants later. Texas, too, was making choices. In the cities and courthouse squares, Reconstruction tried to plant order. Out past the cotton gins and creek crossings, men tended older laws, the law of who got there first, the law of who aimed straighter, the law of kin watching kin. A young Hardin, hounded and half celebrated, slid into that gap and learned to live there. At a country dance, he might move like any other boy, laughing, reckless, shoulders squared at arrival. But on the road between towns, he was a calculation. The angle of a saddle draw, the weight of a glance, the distance to timber if things went wrong. He would not always be the one to start it. Over a deck of cards or a casual insult, the other fellow sometimes leaned first, and in that forward motion Hardin saw his permission. He told himself, as many did, that he never killed a man who didn't need killing. It is a frontier catechism, efficient, circular, and ruinous. The more he lived by it, the less he could live without it. By the time the cattle trails began to whisper north, Abilene, Ellsworth, the long gray ribbon of beeves and dust, Hardin's name was already traveling ahead of him, like heat on a road. Men who'd never seen his face quoted his speed. Boys who'd never fired a round claimed to know his count. The truth had company now. Rumor, fear, and that uniquely Western admiration that mixes charm with dread. He was not yet the seasoned gambler of El Paso, not yet the man whose death would make a saloon fall silent, but he was no longer a boy struggling with sudden consequences. He had become what the times rewarded, a quick study of danger. Some nights, under a moon that made the prairie look like bleached bone, he may have wondered what it would take to stop. A warrant delivered by a decent sheriff, a preacher's hand on his shoulder, or only the heavy insistence of a faster gun. History answers in its own patient way, but part one ends without that mercy. He rides on, toward the cattle towns, the tinny pianos, the fire-lit card tables where bets were pledged with coins and lives. A preacher's son with judgment in his future and a pistol in his present. The law will come for him again, and again he will decide which moves faster. Daybreak lit the prairie as if a match had been struck along the horizon. Thin line of flame, then a spill of gold over the back of 10,000 beeves. The herd pushed north in a shifting brown river, horns like whitecaps, hooves beating the dry earth into thunder. Men rode the flanks, hats pulled low, mouths full of alkali dust. On the cook wagon, tin rattled like a nervous bell. Somewhere down the column, a young trail boss, with a preacher's name and a gunman's reputation, rolled his shoulder to work the ache out and kept the graybacks moving. The Chisholm Trail did not care what a man had done in Texas. It cared only that he could ride, rope, and stay awake when the night pen got restless. And so John Wesley Hardin, alias when he needed one, story following behind like heat, pointed the herd toward Kansas and the Iron Road. Abilene waited at the end of the dust. Joseph McCoy's dream of a railhead for longhorns had turned the once quiet post into a marketplace of beef and bad ideas. Get the cattle there, sell high, and ship east where people were hungry enough to pay for their suppers. That was the arithmetic that built cowtowns, and Abilene was queen of them, built on rail timetables, strong whiskey, and the long patience of drovers who'd been in the saddle since the spring roundup. Every mile north was a bargain struck with luck. The herds bunched at crossings, a thunderstorm could light the sky and stampede beef into black water. Rival outfits cut trails too close, and men reached for their pistols faster than for their words. Along that trail, you learned a certain grammar. Keep the point tight, ride drag with your bandana high against the dust, and don't let another man's cattle crowd you unless you mean to count the cost. Those rules weren't written down, but they were obeyed, mostly. When they weren't, guns did the explaining and the grass drank what it was given. The trail was a school where Hardin's appetite for sudden solutions fit the curriculum too well. By the time the herd swung into Abilene, the place had filled with the noise of money. Boardwalks knocked under the boot heels of Texans who'd been 2 months in the saddle, and saloons breathed out a sweet rot of spilled beer, smoke, and temptation. The stockyards stank with profit. Town ordinances tried to hold the chaos like a worn-out cinch. No firearms in the city limits without leave. No wild shooting. No riding your pony down the street like it was a racetrack. But the first day's pay was always louder than the town council. That's why the city had hired a particular kind of peace officer, showman, scout, pistolero, whose name could turn a crowd's mind the right way. Wild Bill Hickok wore the Marshal Star in Abilene that cattle season of 1871, tall as a doorframe and quicker with a six-gun than any man had a right to be. He'd been brought in after Tom Bear River Smith was killed serving a warrant. The town wanted a reputation that traveled faster than trouble. Hickok supplied it. Hardin and Hickok were, by several tellings, wary constellations circling the same sun. The young Texan could not help but notice the lawman every man had heard of. The lawman could not help but notice the Texas boy whose name came in whispers and boasts. In some versions, chiefly Hardin's own, Hickok admired the lad after a playful, road agent spin disarmed the marshal without malice. In others, Hickok simply told Wesley Clemens to check his pistols and keep his head down while he was in Abilene. Either way, there was a professional understanding. The town needed quiet, the drive hands wanted celebration, and Hardin had better not be the kind of noise that obliges a marshal to draw in the street. Hickok's reign would be short, April to December. But while it lasted, he was the law as far as a man could see down Texas Street. For a few nights it held. Cards, a laugh too sharp, a quarrel knocked flat before it stood up. The pianos in the Alamo and the Bull's Head dueled for customers. Cowboys cut fresh notches in old stories. Hardin played the rooms like a man who understood odds, winning just enough and losing just often enough to keep the table friendly. Yet something about cowtown air stacked the deck against peace. Sleep came late, whiskey early, and decisions were made without witnesses who could spell them back later. On the night that would follow him for the rest of his life, Hardin took a room at the American House Hotel with his cousin Gip Clements. A rancher friend, Charles Cowger, lay down in the adjoining room. They'd been drinking, washing the dust out of their throats with something stronger than coffee. Sometime past midnight, a sound began in the wall. Heavy, laboring snore. The animal noise of a tired man. Hardin shouted to roll over. The noise kept on. Annoyance climbed to rage. Rage to action. He fired through the thin boards. One bullet found Cougar's heart. It was over in less time than it takes to breathe twice. What happened next reads like a stage direction scribbled by chance. Hardin and Clements slipped out a second-story window onto the roof, half-dressed, the hotel behind them holding its breath. Down in the street, a shape approached with a star on its breast and 4 officers at his back. Hickok had heard the shots and come to do the work his badge required. Hardin later wrote that if Wild Bill had found him cornered and unarmed, the marshal would have killed him to keep his legend bright. Perhaps that was fear, perhaps flattery, perhaps both. Hardin leapt from the roof into the darkness and disappeared. He hid the night out in a haystack, horse stolen at first light, and by sundown was 35 miles from Abilene with the law and his reputation at his heels. The local paper made its notes tight and cold. A man killed in his bed by a desperado called Arkansas. The murderer escaped. The number attached, 6 killings, was already arithmetic done by strangers. The town ordinance he'd violated, no gunfire in city limits. Sounds quaint until you imagine the tinderbox a cattle town could be. A single shot after midnight could pour 100 men into the street, drunk and eager to solve grievances that had been aging since the Red River crossing. Hickok's job was not only to arrest a murderer, it was to keep a shrill, dangerous night from becoming a war. In that, at least, he succeeded. Abilene woke the next morning sore-headed but intact, and the herd buyers wrote their figures in ledgers as if nothing had happened. But every ledger that day also carried a new line item of rumor. A Texan so mean he shot a man for snoring. Years later, Hardin would swat at the story with a dark joke. They say I killed 6 or 7 men for snoring. I only killed 1. A line that fits the Old West like a glove. Half shrug, half threat, all theater. In the days that followed, Hardin told another tale. One of those campfire legends that follow men who refuse to be caught. He claimed he ambushed a trio of lawmen who'd come for him at a cow camp, stripped them of their clothes, and sent them walking back to Abilene like penitents. Maybe it happened that way. Maybe it didn't. The point was not which facts survived the retelling. The point was what the retelling did to the man at the center. A story like that is a wanted poster with better adjectives. It moves ahead of you to the next town and greets the bartender before you do. It gives boys a new name to practice in the mirror and gives peace officers a new caution when their boots hit the street. Even Hickok, who generally let facts do his speaking, could not afford to ignore the legend. He had sought to arrest Hardin after the killing and found only the tail of his dust. What Abilene remembered of 1871 was not one cowhand's bad night, but the pressure of the whole season, the way sunlight baked temper into men, the way easy money smashed against civic order, the way a lawman's presence could lower the volume in a room by a full note. Hickok's tenure ended that fall after the street fight with Phil Coe and the accidental killing of Deputy Mike Williams, a burden the marshal carried like a stone in his boot until the end of his days. The cattle trade soon shifted onto other towns. Abilene's wildest years closed up like a saloon at dawn. But for Hardin, the evening at the American house did not close. It kept walking next to him, close as a shadow. Even in this reeling of dates and newspaper clippings, you can hear the quiet question that keeps trailing him. What would he have been without a town like Abilene to answer him back? The cowtown needed men like Hardin to give the place its legend, just as men like Hardin needed cowtowns to give their legend a stage. That is the uneasy pact of the frontier, commerce and danger shaking hands every spring and parting ways before the first snow. The railroad hammered its steel east, cattle prices rose and fell like a drunk at a faro table, and a young gunman headed south again to a Texas that would not forgive him and would not stop making him. He had outpaced one lawman in one town. He had not outrun himself. And Texas had feuds in it that would teach him new arithmetic, how politics and pride add powder to a quarrel, how a badge can mark a man for death, how a single trigger pull can turn a county into a jury. The trail had delivered him to a crossroads. The next road led home, and home was tinder. He turned his horse that way. The lamp-lighted rooms of Abilene fell behind, and the legend kept walking. The road home is a harder thing than any trail north, because you ride not only toward a place, but toward people who remember. Texas had been holding its breath since the war ended. Now it exhaled in long arguments that did not need words. In courthouse squares, in cotton gins, at the rail fence between neighbors who'd once fought under different banners, the same question kept drawing blood. Whose law ruled this ground? The official answer wore Austin stationery, Governor Edmund J. Davis's state police, backed by Reconstruction judges and the long arm of the federal government. The other answer arrived on a quicker breeze. The old order returning, county men who trusted kin over capitals, a badge only when it suited them, and a Winchester when it didn't. The preacher's son rode straight into that dispute, and it fit him like a coat. Wes Hardin tried, briefly stubbornly, to make a smaller life. Early in 1872 in Gonzales County, he stood before a minister and married Jane Bowen, whose people understood both the wealth and the danger tied to his name. A son would come, then daughters, the kind of blessings that ask a man to sit still and build fence. Wes told himself he could do it, but still was a word that never took root in his soil, and the county where he tried to plant it was already sprouting feud. He had returned to Texas with Abilene dust still in his clothes and heat still in his eyes. And there, close as a neighbor's pasture, stood the state police, a new force built in 1870 to corral a violent state that did not believe it needed corralling. They wore a reputation like a bridle that pinched, some companies disciplined and steady, others loose-handed and cruel. Black officers rode in their ranks, proof to freedmen that law could belong to them, proof to many ex-Confederates that it could not. In DeWitt and adjoining counties, Captain Jack Helm became the iron edge of that badge, a big man with a bigger certainty, credited with quieting thieves and accused, sometimes in the same breath, of making prisoners die resisting. Even the people who wanted order winced at how it was supplied. For a moment, the gamble swung the other way. In September 1872, tired of dodging warrants and the new police alike, Hardin walked into the Cherokee County Sheriff's office and surrendered, a gesture that sounded like a life's turning. The state accepted his promise and put him behind a log door to cool. But October arrived with the same old lesson. A jail is just another problem to solve. Wes broke out. Details vary with the telling, as they often do around him. and vanished back into the chaparral with a grin that looked too much like relief. He tried cattle for a spell, cords of trail scents still in his hands. But the brand he wore could no longer be burned off. Gunman, fugitive, trouble. By 1873, the feud that would soak south-central Texas had found its rhythm. On one side, the Sutton crowd, lawmen, state police allies, and their friends. On the other, the Taylors, old-stock settlers with long memories and longer ledgers of grievance. A deputy killed meant a cousin shot, which meant a brother ambushed, which meant a courthouse glowering across at a blacksmith shop, and so on, as if vengeance itself were a local crop to be harvested in season. The Sutton-Taylor feud became the longest and bloodiest in Texas history, not because its men were more wicked than any other counties, but because Reconstruction politics, badges wielded like spears, juries divided by the ballots they cast, gave every killing a second purpose, and every witness a reason to look away. Hardin joined on the Taylor side, where kin by marriage and kin by cause overlapped. He did not invent the storm, he was wind within it. Jack Helm stood on the other ridge of that storm line. He'd once worn a state police captain's straps. Even after dismissal, his name could raise a posse faster than a church bell called Sunday service. The stories that stuck to him came in two kinds: the ones that praised him for planting fear where theft had grown, and the ones that counted the dead whose hands were tied when the counting began. In a place where law's blade had two edges, he'd cut with both. That made him inevitable. It also made him marked. The day they crossed, May of 1873 by most reckonings, the sun made an anvil of the town of Albuquerque, Texas, the kind of crossroads that keeps a cotton gin, a blacksmith's soot, a store, a saloon, and not much else. Helm had business at the forge. Hardin and Jim Taylor had business with Helm. It counts braid and unbraid here. Some say the meeting was accident, a parley that stiffened into threat. Others call it an ambush plotted like a cattle drive. Maps drawn in a quiet room, the hours chosen, the back door noted. Either way, what began in talk finished in smoke. Taylor's revolver misfired once as Helm turned. The second shot drove into the lawman's chest. Hardin's shotgun roared and broke Helm's arm. The captain staggered for the blacksmith's shadow. Taylor raced him there and emptied the cylinder. When the echoes died, Hardin held townsfolk at bay long enough to saddle and leave, a grim escort to silence. If they boasted in the saddle, as witnesses swore, it was the sort of brag that makes sense to men who tell themselves a war has rules. The killing did not end the feud so much as teach it a new step. That night, Taylor men and their friends surrounded the ranch house of Joe Tumlinson, a Sutton ally, until a shouted parley arranged a truce. Then came a treaty in Clinton, ink on paper, hands shaken, pistols not yet oiled. Peace lasted as long as a cowtown promise. In Indianola the next spring, Billy Sutton and Gabriel Slaughter waited on a wharf to leave the county forever. They fell under gunfire before the steamboat's whistle finished its note. The Taylor side wore credit for that work. Hardin admitted he and his brother were in the arrangement one way or another. Texas had long since learned that a man could be everywhere and nowhere at once if enough people were willing to say so. What did any of it buy? Not safety, not peace. A badge pinned on the wrong man breeds outlaws faster than a drought grows dust, and a badge ripped off the right man grows a different crop. Self-appointing regulators, posses with no court at the far end of the ride, committees that meet in the dark with ropes and good intentions. Reconstruction set rules on paper that looked clean at a desk in Austin. On the ground, they blurred with each county line. The state police, conceived to check chaos, made enemies simply by existing, and earned a few more on their own account. When the legislature finally repealed their authorization in 1873, some cheered, some shuddered, and many simply shrugged and cleaned their guns. The Rangers would fill the vacuum nearly as fast as the ink dried. As for Hardin, the act of killing a man whose very name was meant to keep order changed the color of his sky. It told every deputy and every citizens' committee that the preacher's son had moved from quarrelsome outlaw to declared enemy of the system itself. A bounty sharp enough to cut was now nailed to the nearest wall. Newspapers traced his path across counties as if his hoof prints were letters, and a number began to follow him like a stray dog. 21, 30, 40. Each count a calculation of fear, rumor, and the habit men have of enlarging the villain who frightens them. Hardin himself boasted at times and then backtracked, as if the arithmetic were a game he alone knew the rules to. But whatever the figure, the shape was clear. The longer he rode inside the feud's weather, the harder it would be to find anything like ordinary daylight. Jane waited as women do when the world makes their men scarce, moving houses like chess pieces, writing letters that crossed paths with news that came too late. Her brothers were not quiet men. One of them, Brown Bowen, would drag the family's peril along the Florida line and, by way of an intercepted letter, drop a pin for the Rangers to follow years later. In the meantime, Wes wore a dozen names like coats and took to traveling light. He still believed, with the stubbornness of a man raised under revival tents, that his choices were smaller than circumstances allowed, that enemies came to him and not the other way round, that he only drew when the other fellow's eyes gave permission. But Comanche would strip that claim to the bone. First there was a birthday, then a deputy, then a line no man can step back over. The town of Comanche sits in the kind of country where a man can hear his future approach. Hoofbeats slow and regular, like a clock that has forgotten how to lie. May of 1874 would carry the smell of rawhide and politics and celebration, and then, just like that, cordite. The Sutton-Taylor feud had tutored Hardin in the dark arts of grievance. The deputy he would face outside Jack Wright's saloon would teach him the price of being known. A life can hinge on a word or a gesture. Sometimes it hinges on the fact that two men, both quick and certain, are pointed the same direction at the same time. He turned his horse toward Comanche as if it were any other town. It wasn't. The law had been on his trail for years. In Comanche, on his 21st birthday, it would catch up and then lose him again in a new storm of headlines. But that is the next chapter. For now, the writer and the lawman he dropped in Albuquerque stand as a single lesson. In a country split between printed law and practice law, the pistol decides which one speaks first. When the pistol speaks too often, it changes the language for everyone. The day came in like a brass band. Horseflesh lathered, wagers shouted across the square, fiddles scraping out a tune that could hardly keep up with the laughter. Comanche, Texas, May 26, 1874. A town picnic had swelled into a race day, and the dust above the street looked sunlit and permanent, like it belonged to the season. John Wesley Hardin turned 21, with trail money in his pocket and fresh winnings from the track, buying drinks he didn't need and smiling like a man who believed fortune finally owed him a favor. The preacher's son had drifted home and found celebration waiting, which is a dangerous thing for a man whose enemies read newspapers. He moved in and out of Jack Wright's saloon the way a river moves around a rock, his hat tipped, his six-gun heavy only when he remembered it. Brown County lay just west, a place with its own quarrels and its own deputies, and on this day one of them rode toward Comanche with a reason. Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb was a young man by the record, quiet, able, and, depending on who was talking, either wary of Hardin or hunting him as a matter of duty. Webb stepped into a town already stretched tight by heat, liquor, and rumor, the sort of afternoon when a badge is both shield and target. Hardin and Webb faced each other near the saloon door. What happened in the seconds that followed is the West's old problem. Testimony bends toward the teller. Witnesses remembered a few words, a pause, the shine of hardware. Many said Hardin drew first, fast as a rattler, and Webb never cleared leather. Hardin later claimed that Webb had a self-cocking bulldog revolver, half hid in his hand, and that the deputy's move gave him leave to live. Truth is a coin that changes hands in a crowd. What did not change was the noise. Black powder cracks, a man folding near the threshold, and a town suddenly cold sober. The square exploded. Men running, women pulled to cover, the fiddles silenced in mid-note. Inside the saloon, hands went off their glasses and onto the bar, as if the oak itself might keep them honest. Outside, Webb lay dead on the boards near Wright's doorway. A deputy was down in the street, and all at once that made Hardin something different from even the worst sort of pistolman. He wasn't simply a quarrelsome cowhand or a feud's hired weather. He was now the man who had killed a peace officer in bright Texas daylight. The crowd shifted its weight from curiosity to purpose. Sheriffs and citizen committees were spoken of in the same breath. Hardin felt the wind change. He and his kinsmen, Clement's cousins among them, pushed through the confusion and out of town like men leaving a burning building. Behind them, Sheriff John Carnes scrambled what he could. Comanche had the peculiar silence that follows gunfire, the air still tasting of sulfur, the horses skittish, the children suddenly obedient. The pleasure of the day buckled at the knee and sat down. And in doorways, men who had been telling Hardin stories for years began telling a different one. It is a small step from fastest man I ever saw to ought to be caught. The law's first answers were immediate and ugly. Hardin's father, his brother Joseph, and other kin were seized. Within days, vigilantes hauled Joseph and two cousins from jail into the dark and hanged them. The rope speaks without a judge, and it speaks long. Whatever mercy the town might have had was cut from the script that night. Hardin, now as much a family mourner as a fugitive, swore he would balance the ledger and rode for distance. His wife Jane gathered the child and followed when she could. Vengeance had calluses in Texas, and this vow fit the hand. Newspapers came howling. Desperado, they printed in a type tall as a window. Man-killer. Editors from Austin to Galveston set his name in iron and added numbers beside it, as if the debt he owed could be rendered in digits. The Sutton-Taylor feud had already written him into headlines. Comanche put his name on circulars. Pursuit spread like a grass fire, posses in the brush, rangers asking quiet questions, sheriffs reading the mail more carefully than before. It is hard to live between towns when every town thinks it knows your face. The fact of who drew first kept breeding children. Some witnesses swore Hardin reached first and clean. Others thought Webb moved a fraction and paid for it. Hardin, when he wrote later, insisted he saw death in the deputy's hand and did what men do when the world narrows to an instant. This argument, gesture against gesture, would follow him into the courthouse years later, and it would not save him. But on this afternoon it served as personal liturgy, the story a man tells himself so sleep will come. The frontier forgives many things. Killing a lawman is not among them. Texas turned the heat higher. The legislature in Austin, answering public fear and county petition alike, authorized Governor Richard B. Hubbard to post a reward that a man could feel in his bones, $4,000 for Hardin's arrest. It was January 20th, 1875, some months after the Comanche shooting, a date that said the state meant to outlast any fugitive's luck. A number like that draws more than lawmen. It draws hangers-on, bounty thinkers, and the kind of drifter who believes Providence rides in his saddlebag. The Rangers, reconstituted and keen to prove their worth, did what good trackers do. They stopped trying to be faster than a quick man and started trying to be more patient. One of them, working undercover, read other people's letters until the right one spoke. Family lines passing along a sister's love, a brother's whereabouts, an alias that fit too neatly. J.H. Swain. The trail bent toward the pine and sand of the Gulf states, Florida fisheries, Alabama lumberyards, card tables humming in rooms that smelled of resin and sweat. The chase left Texas without leaving Texas's mind. But before the train tickets and the Rangers' quiet work, before a sheriff in Florida heard a knock at his office door, there was still the human mess Comanche could not sweep away. A deputy's funeral, a lawman's widow scanning the parlor for a man who would not walk in again, a town divided between those who wanted to empty the jails of anyone named Hardin and those who had once borrowed a horse from Wes's father. And there was Jane, the girl who had married a legend in the making and now had to live with the shape it cast on her children's faces. The frontier can be loud enough to forget the soft parts. The soft parts last longer. If you listen closely to the Comanche Day, you can hear both the gun and the pen. The gun put Webb on the boards and drove Hardin out into the scrub. The pen made a case the state could carry from one courthouse to the next. Editors counted. Legislators posted rewards. Rangers kept notes. Even Hardin, years later behind stone, would take up a pen and argue that he never fired except to live. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he needed to. On this birthday afternoon, belief didn't matter. The crowd's eyes said what the statute books would eventually write. A life had been taken from the law's side of the street. That always draws a line that cannot be recrossed. So Comanche stands as the hinge. Before it, a fast young man weaving through cattle towns and county grudges, admired by some who should have known better. After it, a fugitive with a price on his head so real you could nearly hear the coins clink. The story of his capture is a train story, and trains run on timetables the way fate does. But that belongs to another chapter. The gilt and the iron bracelets, the ranger with a warrant in his pocket and a plan drawn down to the minute. For now, fix your eyes on the door of Jack Wright's saloon and the dust beyond it. The deputy lies still. The crowd has chosen its side. The birthday boy is already halfway to the tree line, finally understanding what it means to be faster than the law and what it costs to keep proving it. The Gulf air was different, heavy with pine and brine, the kind of damp that slows a horse and quickens a man's temper. If Texas had taught John Wesley Hardin to live by the split second, Florida and Alabama demanded patience, an alias, and a knack for being unremarkable. He learned to answer to Mr. Swain, John or James, depending on who asked, and to keep the brim low and the cards close. A lumberyard on the Florida-Alabama line offered wages that smelled of sap and sawdust, and for a while he let his hands remember honest work. But letters have longer legs than men. Somewhere back in Texas, an undercover ranger named Jack Duncan opened one addressed to Hardin's father-in-law and read, in the careless comfort of family writing to family, that Swain was living on the border, right where the timber met the rail. The alias had been borrowed from a Brenham town marshal married into the Klan. Now the debt came due. The state had posted $4,000 to the man who could deliver Hardin. Money like that makes strangers attentive. Under the live oaks and Spanish moss, the days repeated and the nights did not end. There were fistfights over nothing, and one spring evening in 1876, a peacemaker stepped between Hardin and another man and took a bullet for his trouble. In Mobile that fall, a short arrest over marked cards put Hardin in a cell long enough to study the timbers and the temper of men who wore badges on streets he did not know. News from Texas drifted in like Tide Flats gossip, the feud, the vigilantes, the rope finding his kin. He told himself that distance was a kind of pardon. Distance is only a map. He did not move alone. Cousins and in-laws braided into his trail, Brown Bowen among them, hard, restless, his own warrants clattering behind like tin on a wedding buggy. Family kept you fed and hid. Family could also mark you for the men who read other people's mail. By the summer of 1877, the Rangers had patience enough to match Hardin's speed. They did not gallop so much as listen. One read letters. Another asked questions without sounding as if he cared about the answers. A third watch train schedules the way a good gambler watches a rival's hands. They followed the paper. They followed the habit. And then at last they followed the smoke of a pipe on a warm day in Pensacola. What happened on that August afternoon lives in the kind of historical twilight that makes dates quarrel. Markers and archives say the 23rd, newspapers the 24th. Call it late August and be done. The train had barely taken its breath in the station when a quiet rush of men stepped into the aisle. Texas Ranger John B. Armstrong in the lead, local officers beside him, the whole party moving with the fixed calm of men who have ended a chase in their heads long before their boots arrived. Hardin sat with two companions. One reached for iron and died with it still in his hand. Man, the papers would print. Armstrong's shot folded him where he stood. Hardin's own .44 snagged, legend says, on the loop of his suspenders. A blow put him to the floor, and by the time the train exhaled again, the most hunted man in Texas had irons on his wrists and a ranger's hand on his collar. If you prefer Hardin's version, he was smoking his pipe, unarmed and surprised. Every outlaw deserves his final flourish. The ticket, however, read west. There is a peculiar mercy in due process. It forces time to walk when men would rather run. Armstrong waited out extradition papers in Alabama, the Rangers keeping their prize in a cell while telegraphs tapped the route home. Crowds gathered at stops along the way, wanting to see if a man made of rumor could keep his shape under daylight. Some said Hardin looked smaller than the stories. Others claimed the stories looked smaller than the man. He was brought to Comanche for trial, the law taking him back to the very county where Deputy Charles Webb had fallen. In June of 1878, a jury weighed those seconds at Jack Wright's saloon, the half gesture, the gleam of a pistol, the argument that never finishes, and returned what the state needed to hear. He would serve 25 years. A date at the Huntsville walls followed, the kind of appointment a man keeps no matter how late he is to every other. They logged him into the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville as convict number 7109 on an October day in 1878, a number sharp as a new file. The noise of the place made a different music. Keys, chain, the shouted arithmetic of men counting hours until they add up to something a man can walk through. Hardin tried the locks because that is the first reflex of any creature that has lived on the underside of the law. In 1879, he and a knot of convicts dug toward the prison armory, a project interrupted only hours before success. Punishment followed, graded and methodical, the staff teaching with lash and solitude the one lesson an outlaw hates to learn. Time is stronger than nerve. Years like this either rot a man or ripen him. Hardin, for the first time since boyhood, found himself surrounded by books he could not outrun. Theology first, because a preacher's son reaches for familiar tools in unfamiliar rooms. Then the law, black letter, footnoted, patient. Sundays he stood before the same men he'd tunneled with and spoke on scripture as superintendent of the prison Sunday school. Weekdays he argued hypotheticals with the debating society and turned case reports until the Latin bled into English. A persistent wound flared and put him down for months, reminders that even a quick hand cannot draw against infection. But he rose to the routine as a man rises to the weather, grudgingly at first, then with the resigned competence of a farmer who knows the sky won't answer to him. Every now and then, the old mathematics returned. In 1892, a court reached back into his past and tacked on 2 years for an earlier killing, the paper sentence set to run alongside the iron years he was already carrying. The figure on the ledger hardly changed, but the bookkeeping reminded everyone, the state, the prisoner, the readers of small-town weeklies, that nothing in Hardin's history ever fully stopped happening. He wrote when they let him, sometimes by a guard's favor, sometimes by channels that made the warden squint. He wrote in the tone of a man who believed his own case law, that he had never fired but to save himself, that the world, when it came for him, always came first. The pen steadied him the way a pistol once had. He was still aiming, now at the story instead of the enemy. If you are looking for the single chord that changed, it is this. The man who had made his living in fractions of a second began to live by paragraphs and pages. He studied until the words arranged themselves into arguments he could carry into the daylight someday. He prayed, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because the walls turned men toward questions they avoided in the open. Fellow inmates saw a fair-skinned, dark-haired, scar-stitched figure who could preach in the morning and quote statutes after supper. A man drawn suddenly to order after years of supplying chaos. The guards saw what guards always hope to see. A prisoner who learned to measure his steps. The calendars turned without asking anyone's permission. When the lock finally opened, it did so not with a cinematic crash, but with the dry click of paperwork finished. February 17, 1894. By then he had logged roughly 17 years inside on a 25-year sentence, credited time and conduct doing the quiet work that iron once did loudly. A month later, the governor's pardon reached for his past and blessed what the door had already allowed, and by summer he had passed the state bar. He walked out a free man shaped into a different weapon, a lawyer's mind where a gunman's reflex had lived. Friends welcomed him back to Gonzales County. Enemies took note. His children measured the space between the man they remembered and the one who stepped through the gate. There is no ceremony for that reunion, only the steady labor of learning each other's faces. Of the many reckonings a legend must endure, the cruelest is arithmetic. In saloons and on porches, men still traded numbers like hands at 40, 21, 27, 42, while the man himself set about learning the statutes he had once outrun. He was not cleansed, he was changed. Huntsville had not made him gentle, it had made him deliberate. If Texas ever wanted an answer to the question it had been asking since Reconstruction, law or legend, which moves faster? Hardin walked out carrying both, one holstered behind the other. He would find soon enough that the world beyond the walls had not slowed to accommodate him. El Paso waited with its bright windows and shorter tempers, its juries that met at midnight and wore no robes, its lawmen who read the same code he did and quoted the same rounds he once spoke. But for the moment, just this moment, the man the Rangers had dragged off a train in Pensacola stood in free air, holding a license and a history, and tried to decide which one would speak first. The desert at the far edge of Texas can make a man think he has outrun his past. It is a clean geography, hard light on harder stone, a wind that scrubs names off the day as quickly as they're written. When John Wesley Hardin reached El Paso in 1895, papers in his pocket and a lawyer's license to steady his hands, he told friends he meant to practice quietly, to argue with statutes instead of men. He had stepped out of Huntsville with paragraphs where reflex used to be, a man intent on proving that patience could be as sharp as a six-gun. For a season, he even believed it. He opened a law office. He took clients. He wore the plain black coat of a counselor and walked with the measured pace of a man pretending the calendar is his ally. He had been pardoned in March 1894 and passed the Texas bar that July. On paper, fate had shaken his hand. In practice, the border town shook back. El Paso in the mid-1890s was a town at a crosswind. Army freight and cattle money, gamblers with their own arithmetic, a courthouse trying to hold shape in a place where the street still had a vote. Hardin's docket carried ordinary quarrels and extraordinary entanglements. One case in particular tied a knot he could not loosen, the defense of a cattle thief named Martin Moroz, often Moroz, who had slipped over to Juarez to stay ahead of U.S. deputies. Moroz's wife Beulah, young, pretty, and used to choosing men who could move the day around them, hired Hardin, and rumor says the business of law tangled with another kind. By spring and summer, that talk had warmed into accusation, that money and affection had blurred, that the woman's loyalties crossed the river more often than the man she married, that the lawyer who'd once outrun posses now thought he could outrun scandal. Even careful historians grant the drift. Hardin took Moroz's case and Beulah's company, and neither went quietly. The Border writes its own headlines. Moroz was shot and killed near the Mexican Central Railway Bridge between Juarez and El Paso. An ambush, some said, with whispers, never proven, that Hardin's hand helped arrange it, whether for money, jealousy, or simple impulse. Facts come thin here, bottled and rebottled by time. What remains certain is that Beulah lingered in Hardin's orbit and that the affair, whatever its exact boundaries, left a ring of enemies. A lawman's son, Constable John Selman, Jr., arrested Beulah for brandishing a gun. Hardin confronted the young officer, and words sharpened to threats that bled into the day's gossip by supper. When a quarrel involves a Hardin and a Selman in El Paso, it finds its way to the father. And John Selman Sr., older, weathered, sometimes a lawman, sometimes not, was not a man to watch a fight from the sidewalk. Two men with long shadows met in a small town. On the afternoon of August 19, 1895, the elder Selman spoke hard to Hardin in the street, each measuring the other's eyes. Hours later, as night dropped like a stage curtain, Hardin leaned over a bar at the Acme Saloon, shooting dice and daring luck to come closer. Dice are theater, so is a door swinging open at the wrong time. Selman stepped in from the heat, drew, and fired. The shot took Hardin in the back of the head. He dropped against oaken tile. The green felt still talking in his hands. Selman fired again and again. The crowd did what crowds always do. They bolted. They stared. They memorized fragments they would repeat for years. A woman screamed. A bartender put his hands up as if the ceiling were a judge. The quickest man in Texas had died without finishing his sentence. The law, which had chased Hardin for half a lifetime, finally arrived on time. Selman was arrested and indicted for murder. At trial, he offered the frontier's evergreen defense, that the dead man was reaching, that an old quarrel gave the moment its permission, that a preemptive bullet is simply self-defense that beat the clock. The jury hung, no consensus in a town that both feared Hardin and believed a man should be shot from the front, if at all. Selman posted bond for a retrial that never came. On April 6, 1896, U.S. Marshal George Scarborough shot him dead after a midnight argument. If El Paso had wanted a clean moral, it got what border towns usually get instead, an ending that introduces another ending. What did the killing settle? Not the arithmetic. Even as a sheet was pulled over Hardin, men in doorways resumed the numbers game. 21, 27, 42, each tally a way of turning rumor into ledger. At sentencing years earlier, he had claimed 42. Newspapers had printed 27. Scholars shrug and leave a range. In excess of 20, the count matters less than the shape. A life lived in skirmishes, a creed that reduced seconds to verdicts. When such a man dies with his head turned away from the muzzle, people argue not only about facts but about justice, what it should look like, and whether it is still justice if it arrives from behind. The estate was thin, cash that would not fill a hat, 2 pistols, law books, a little jewelry, meager trophies for so much noise. The body was carried to Concordia Cemetery, El Paso's Boot Hill, where the dirt is busy with soldiers, gamblers, and children claimed by desert fevers. They fenced his grave to keep souvenir hunters from whittling it away. Today, a Texas historical marker stands near the iron, making neat sentences out of untidy years. The prairie has a way of finishing stories that men start badly. If there is a lesson that does not preach, it is this. The Old West made legends out of habits. For Hardin, the habit was to draw conclusions faster than anyone else in the room, sometimes right, often ruinous. He tried to trade that reflex for argument and oath when he left the prison gate. The law gave him a desk and a second chance. But chance is a climate, and the climate of the border did what it often does. It offered a woman who would be used in stories, a case that would never sit still, a lawman whose life taught him to recognize trouble by its hat. One insult became one arrest, became one gun on a barroom threshold, and the sums of a lifetime upended in a crack of powder. Stand at Concordia at sundown, and the wind will do its old trick. Polish a name, erase a smaller one, push sand through the chain link like a reminder. People come to that rectangle of ground to see whether the myth has a weight to it. It does. The grave is low, the fence is ordinary, and the boy named for a preacher lies under a sky that never seems to finish what it started. In the end, faster than the law isn't a boast, it's a diagnosis. The law walks. A man can sprint for years, live on borrowed seconds, eat the fruit of his own speed. But the law, drawn by juries, by editors' ink, by the memory of widows and the scrawl of ledgers, keeps the pace it keeps. It doesn't need to win the morning if it holds the evening. On August 19, 1895, in a room with dice and gaslight, the evening arrived. What, then, is left of John Wesley Hardin? Not an alibi. Those dry up. Not even a number. Those blur. What remains is a silhouette that history still argues with. A brilliant, frightened, lethal boy who studied enough law to convince himself that every draw was justified. A fugitive so theatrical that his capture needed a ranger with a legend of his own. A jailhouse preacher who could quote case law by lamplight. A licensed attorney who kept the habits that had cost him his first youth. You can point to the door of the Acme and call it fate. You can point to the mirror and call it choice. The West doesn't mind. It has room for both. In Wild West towns, the last line is often a question because questions are what the desert leaves you with. Was Hardin finally a product of bad times, or did he manufacture a few of his own? Did justice need a judge that night, or was a constable's hard reckoning enough? The dice, if you believe the witnesses, were still clattering when he fell. The story is still clattering now, down the years, daring each generation to say what a man deserves when he never learned how to stop.